Dear students, welcome to this presentation of the second part of Unit 9, which is the finished part of the unit we started with the previous video about the cities. We will start talking about the cities around the world. First, talking about Europe, a continent with very dense population, so lots of cities that cover a great part of the territory. Here we can see this painting of Europe being kidnapped by Zeus in the shape of a bull. Some of the most relevant, most iconic cities in the world and history can be located in Europe. For example, the city of Rome or Moscow. But there are also some very important cities which nowadays are very modern cities, well connected with the rest of the world. For example, here we can see the Canary Dwarf in London, which is what we could call the CBD, the Central Business District, very modern area where most of the economic activities are carried out. This is the city of London. We can see how from a center it grew, expanding throughout a great amount of territory, becoming one of the largest and most important cities in the world. Around 12 million people in the city itself, almost 20 million people in the metropolitan area. It has some historical center, but also other peripheral areas, the outskirts, the suburbs. Suburb in English is very different than a suburbio in Spanish. Suburb is a territory in the outskirts whose function is residential, so it's used for having houses. Normally it has a regular layout like this one, which is a radial layout, and has, like in this case, individual houses for the families. Here we can see the largest cities in Europe. There are some very important ones, and for example, we can mention this axis from London to Milan, which is a territory almost covered in cities. It has very dense population, especially this part, England, Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, which it's a network of connected cities. The European cities has a common structure very clear with a historical center. We can see it, for example, here in Barcelona, how from the original city center, which normally is very clearly defined. Remember that originally these cities were surrounded by a wall, so they still have this shape that marks the historical city center. And from this part, with irregular layout, with narrow streets, without open spaces, there were some large avenues built with a regular layout, a grid shape, or like in this case, a radial structure that conform a residential area. All of this is what is called the city extension. All of these parts surrounding the city with a very regular, clear layout is the city extension, built because of the people that wanted to live outside the city center. Remember, when industry was built in the middle of the cities, people left these areas for living outside in better neighborhoods. It was originally for the bourgeoisie, the uh, people with a better economic level. Now they are just part of the city. They were planned from the origins with this very regular grid layout, like in this part of Barcelona. and they allow the people to live there in better conditions. Now, the city center do not have factories, as you know, but there are other functions: the administration, the politics, the companies, businesses, shops, the touristical areas. The city center is normally very expensive and it attracts other activities. People prefer to live outside because it's better for living. You wouldn't like to live in a very, very touristical place because there aren't convenience stores. You cannot just buy groceries on the corner. You need to go outside this touristical area. You won't find good, cheap houses. Everything is very expensive. There's a lot of traffic, a lot of people, and so on. For that reason, people live outside. And even they can go even further away from the city, creating these bedroom cities or dormitory cities that surround the main one. For example, this in the outskirts of Valladolid have uh, these residential areas in the outskirts. We can see how they have been planned. They have better living conditions than in the city centers. They are individual houses, each one with a patio, with a swimming pool, some of them organized in these very comfortable suburbs out in the outskirts of the city. In America, there are some of the most famous cities in the world with very modern, tall skyscrapers. For example, here in Chicago, especially in North America, we can find these uh, typical modern cities: tall buildings, modern office and companies and bank area, the financial center, and all of this located in what is called the CBD, which is the area of the city where the companies, businesses, and the banks, Cs, are established. It's the Central Business District, the CBD. For example, Nueva York, one of the most iconic ones. Here we can see the island of Manhattan, or other kind of cities, more traditional ones at the south. For example, New Orleans, which has this different structure. And as America has very large open spaces, they have normally a very important residential area that surrounds the city and has been very well planned. For example, Boca Raton in Florida, that has this grid structure with very spectacular shapes viewed from above because it has been planned as a residential place from the beginning. But even further to the south, we can find different kind of cities. For example, in Mexico, there are some very big cities with an Spanish origin. For example, Guadalajara. Here we can see the cathedral, or the extremely large, the huge Ciudad de Mexico, Mexico 10, which is one of the largest cities in the world because of the great growth that it has had thanks to these expansions. Here we can see from the origin of the Ciudad de Mexico how it grew, covering all the surrounding lands. Then in Asia, here we can see the statue of Genghis Khan, we can find some of the oldest cities in the world. Think that the first cities were developed in Mesopotamia, later in India, China, Egypt, and Mesopotamia and India and China are of course in Asia. This Middle East have the oldest cities in the world. But nowadays, when we think of Asia, we think of very, very densely populated areas and some very modern cities. For example, Shanghai in China. China has huge cities that aren't just crowded, but very modern, with a very important relevance in our world for their companies, for the money they move, for the innovation of their buildings, the new technologies, and so on. Of course, very crowded areas like here in Delhi, in India, and again in China, in Hong Kong, we can see the density of population. For example, here, this residential building with thousands of little windows showing how thousands of people can live here. This is a traffic jam in Beijing entering to the city. And of course, there are some very important traditional cities with a very valuable historical patrimony. For example, Kyoto, the old capital of Japan. And in the Middle East, in Turkey, we can see Istanbul, the old Constantinople, uh, the old capital of the Byzantine Empire, very important city for the Ottomans, later for the Turks, an iconic city with a huge history, which is also in the connection of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea and between Asia and Europe. This is this bridge called the Keys of Two Continents, which is the meeting of these two uh, areas, Europe and Asia. And for example, we can mention Jericho in Palestine, which is considered to be the oldest city which is still inhabited. It has up to 11,000 years. And outside Asia, in Oceania, there are very few cities, and the ones that can be found there are especially in Australia and New Zealand. They are modern cities at European style connected with the world. For example, Sydney. And in Africa, the origin of humanity. Here in the background, we can see the Rift Valley, the place where all the human beings were originated in prehistory. It's not a continent famous for its cities, but it has some. And because of the great population growth that Africa has, as we explained it in previous unit, the cities are also growing a lot. There are some very old and important cities, for example, the ones in Egypt. This is Alexandria, which is not one of the oldest cities in Egypt, but it was founded by Alexander the Great, so it has all more than 2,000 years old. Uh, in sub-Saharan Africa, we can mention Abuja in Nigeria, which is one of the most important cities in this area, and it's growing a lot because of this population growth. And probably the wealthiest cities in Africa are the ones in South Africa. For example, Johannesburg here in South Africa, which looked like a very modern city. It has still some problems inside and lots of inequalities. One of the most important characteristics of the cities in less developed areas is that they are huge cities because of this great population growth and have on them huge inequalities. We can see some very modern buildings, uh, tall skyscrapers, banks, offices, and in other parts of the city, very, very poor residential areas, shanty towns, slums, and so on. So in developed countries, we can distinguish the city itself and the outskirts, urbanization and industrial areas, and even surrounding municipalities, so surrounding cities, smaller cities that depend on the main one. and between them a transport network is established. The cities relate with each other thanks to this transport. So in the city itself, we can find the historic center, which is the origin of the city, normally with an irregular layout, a narrow street without open spaces. Then the city extensions that has this residential function, normally a regular layout, long straight avenues, parks, green areas, etc. And the industrial estates. An industrial estate, as you know, is an area where industry is located. Industry, factories, etc. Because remember that the industry left the city. There aren't great factories in the cities because they pollute, they make noise, they create traffic jams, they need a lot of space, so they prefer being located in the outskirts of the cities where the land is cheaper, when there are more lands available, when they can be more controlled, etc. And very important, this CBD, the Central Business District, which is where the seats of the companies or the banks, the offices are located. Is characteristic of these very tall skyscrapers, modern buildings, and so on. And in the outskirts, we can find these residential areas where the people live, instead of in the center of the city. They have a close layout and an open regular layout. So in the city center, we have this irregular structure, and then the city expansions grew with a regular layout, and then in the outskirts we can find other residential places still with this shape. In the outskirts we can find this urbanization for living, normally in individual houses where a family can live more comfortable instead of the city center. You cannot have a nice individual house in the city center unless you are able to pay a huge amount of money. And then we can also find these industrial estates, these industrial areas where the factories and the buildings that cannot be located on the city are placed. So here we can see a city map with these areas perfectly marked. Here in Valencia we can see the city center, then the original city expansions from the 19th century, and then it grew a lot in recent times with a more regular layout, and these areas also for living there and some offices and shops in between. If we had a larger photo, we could see also the outskirts. For example, this is probably an industrial or commercial area, more farther away from the city itself. Here we can see how the city is not just the city itself, but this metropolitan area that surrounds it and is connected through the transport network that connect the city with other smaller cities and towns around, because people can go from these places to the city for some services, for leisure, for example, for attending to the university, or for going to specialized shops, or for going to work in some cases. It creates, for example, these dormitory cities where the people just sleep and then they work and make their life outside them in the cities. Here we can see a typical historic center in this irregular layout that normally aren't devoted to residential function, but others. For example, here we can see shops, these pedestrian areas for the people to walk, uh, offices, museums, administrative buildings, and so on. There are some houses where the people can live, but they normally are very, very expensive. So most of the people live outside the center in these residential areas that can have tall blocks of flats for many families to live in, or even further away in individual houses or in smaller cities or towns connected with the main city. And also, the modern cities have this CBD, which is where the offices, the banks, the companies can be found. It's typical of, for example, the American cities. It's in the middle, but for the European cities cannot be found in the middle of the city center because it's occupied by the historical parts. Like the Americans do not have this long history, the CBD is normally in the middle. But for the European, it's close to the center, but not in the center itself. For example, here in the four towers of Madrid, it's not exactly in the middle of Madrid, but it's close to it. And further away, the residential areas. They can be in uh, the city itself or in these dormitory towns. For example, Getafe, near Madrid. There are many, many people that live in these areas, but they go to work, for example, to Madrid or to the surrounding towns. In this image, we can say how the city center is here, the expansions, and further away, this is, of course, the harbor, industrial or commercial areas, for example, the shopping centers and so on outside the city, some green areas, all of these activities that need a great amount of land and cannot be placed inside the city. Here in Madrid is again very easy to see the, the center with this irregular original structure marked by the place where the old walls were. For example, here dividing the rest of Madrid from the Retiro, there was a wall. This is, of course, the territory of the palace and so on. And then outside it, the city expansions that grew in the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, allowing the city to have more and more and more population and more space. As all of this was planned, they have this regular layout. And then, of course, the city continued growing in the 50s and the 60s and so on. This satellite image shows Valladolid from further away, so it's easier to distinguish the territories. In the center, as always, the historic city center with, for example, the cathedral. Well, the main church in this case. Then, outside it, the residential areas, which are the city expansions that grew around here. And then further away, we can see, for example, here in the outskirts, a place where the industries are located or other activities that cannot be in the middle of the city. For example, here, the hospital, or around here, other industrial estates. And then further away, more residential places, carefully planned with a regular shape, and so on. And of course, uh, some neighborhood places, some neighborhood towns or cities that provide Valladolid with people, with resources, and so on, connected by the roads and the transport networks. So that was the structure of the developed countries. The developing or emerging countries has some similarities but also some differences because the evolution of the cities wasn't exactly the same. They have very few cities, but these cities are very densely populated. So they have very few cities with a great amount of population on them. Normally they are on the coast or very well communicated with the coast. It is because most of these cities developed during the time of the colonization, where the Europeans went and conquered other places. It's easy to see, for example, when looking at a map of Africa, most of the important cities are located around the coast because it's where they have connection with the sea and they could trade. Or in cases they are inside the continent, they are very well connected to the coastline with train tracks or highways and so on. They have industrial activities in the cities. This is important because, as you know, industries in the developed countries aren't in the cities. They were in the 19th centuries, but they move out because of the problems they cause, lack of quality of life and so on. But these factories that in some cases move to the outskirts of the city, in some other places move to these emerging countries. So they have the industry the developed countries do not want. They have a historic center with the traditional buildings that in some cases can have a great historical importance. And they normally have a European neighborhood because of these origins of uh, colonialism that established European population in these areas. And they normally have nowadays embassies or residences and so on. And then, even when they are emerging countries, they have a CBD, this central business district with tall skyscrapers, with modern buildings, and so on. Because remember, the emerging countries can have these modern places. What they have is a great inequality on them. That means that there are some very rich and modern areas with other ones that has very poor living conditions, which are the slums or the shanty towns, which are these areas where lots of people live in an improvised manner, all of them together without a city plan and with disposable materials, improvised buildings, and so on. And of course, they have industrial estates with other factories and the people that work on them. These are the main structures of the emerging countries. This is an important word that we need to know. It's macrocephaly. Macrocephaly, macro means big, cephalus means head. It's a characteristic of many of the emerging countries. For example, in Africa, in the south of Asia, or in South America, where they do not have a lot of cities, but they have one or two, a small group of cities which are very, very big. For example, African countries do not have many cities, but the ones they have are huge. Or in South America, the capitals of, well, for example, cities of Bogota or Caracas are huge, are much larger than most European cities because the people move to the city. Remember, these countries have a huge uh, increase in population, so more and more and more people go to live in that cities. What happened? The city needs to grow, but they do not have a planification. They cannot grow so quick, so they create these slums, these shanty towns, which are low quality areas. So that's the definition of macrocephaly. A country that has one or very few very large cities. Nowadays we live in a world of cities and our lives are controlled from them. The economy, politics, the society, education, healthcare, everything take place in cities. We can see how the most urbanized areas are Central Europe from London to Milan, the east coast of the United States, Southeast Asia, but we can find cities, for example, as we said, in the coast of Africa and in the northern coast as well. Here we can see Egypt, very important, large cities, coast of South America and Central and North America. Here we can see some of the largest cities in the world with their population and their shape. In red, the North American ones, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami, and so on. In yellow, the Asian cities. We can see, for example, how Beijing has uh, more than twice the population of Chicago, but is much smaller. What does it mean? That it has a huge density of population. For example, Shanghai is larger, is most populated than New York, but much smaller for these differences in density of population. And here in black, those are the African cities. In orange, the ones in Middle East and Africa, like Cairo, and in blue, the European ones. There are some classifications that organize the cities. One of the ways to create a ranking is based on the amount of people, but we don't just use the number of people to distinguish important cities or less important ones. For example, there are many cities in Asia, China, India, which are larger, have more population than New York, for example. But obviously, when we think of a big city, an important city, New York is one of the ones that appears the first. It is because the population is not everything. The importance of the city is based on their influence, the way that it connects with the world. For example, here we can see a map of the world made up of the airlines, planes that fly from one place to the other. We can see how the most connected places are Europe, especially Central Europe, North America, especially the west coast of the United States, and the east and southeast of Asia. There are some cities that has a huge importance even when they aren't very densely populated. For example, Silicon Valley in the United States, which is important because of the technology and the companies that are established there. This is a map of the companies in Silicon Valley, and we can see, for example, IBM, uh, HP, Microsoft, Yahoo, some of the most important companies in the world. Or for example, because of economy. This is the stock market in New York, Wall Street, which is the most important stock market in the world, affects the global economy. For that reason, we say that New York is a global city. Or it can be for the transport and communication of people and goods. This is Singapore, a city in the country Singapore, which is a very small country with a huge economic importance in our world because it's located in the trade routes that connect China with the rest of the world, especially with Africa and Europe, because they do not need to pass through Singapore to go to the United States. So it connects China with many other places in the world, and as China produces lots and lots and lots of products, most of them pass through Singapore. If that Singapore harbor closes, the economy will uh, have a huge crisis. So it's important, it's essential for the world. Or going to Europe, Rotterdam, which is another merchantry harbor where the goods that come to Europe are disembarked and distributed through the continent. It's the largest port in Europe. And there are other cities that have importance for other elements. For example, their cultural importance, their history, or for example, this is Milan. We can mention the important Milan has in fashion or design or tourism or even shops. For example, this is the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele, which is a very, very luxurious, high-class shopping center in Milan, near the Duomo. This is Kearney's Global Cities Index, which is a classification of the global cities according to their importance. It's not a list of the most populated cities in the world. If it was, the Asian cities and the South American ones will be on top. But it's not. Which one's it's on top? New York. New York is not the most populated cities in the world. There are many of them that have more population, but it has a huge relevance in economy, politics, communication. We all know New York. We all have heard of New York. We have seen images of it, pictures, films, and it's represented in our brain as the symbol of a city, and for that reason is on top. Then London, economic, political, uh, individual, personal importance. Paris, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Singapore. We can go down and see that Madrid is in the 15th place, which is not bad. And then Barcelona in the 23rd, which are the only Spanish cities uh, worth to figure in this global cities index. Most of them you can see are located in North America, in the United States, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Washington, and so on. But there are more and more cities whose importance is increasing that are in Asia. Tokyo, Hong Kong, Singapore, Beijing, Seoul, etc. And some others in Europe, London, Paris, Berlin, Madrid, of course, Moscow, and so on. So this established a hierarchy. Remember, a hierarchy is a classification between some, in this case, between cities. Each city has its sphere of influence, so the areas this city exerts its influence over, because each city can expand their influence to the neighboring areas and can connect with them through roads, through means of communication, and so on. And the importance of a city depends on how well connected it is. Other cities can connect as well with different kinds of relations. For example, they can depend on the main city. In that case, they have some sort of submission, or they can share, for example, population that go to work to other places, and so on. The importance of a city is measured in according to the relevance, to the influence they can cause on other places. And it's based on innovation, the ability to have new technologies, good education, well-trained people exert this influence on other places. People will want to study there or to hire professionals from that city. And also specialization. We can go to a city for some products, but for example, we wouldn't go to Madrid to buy groceries or to buy bread. It wouldn't make sense because we can find a supermarket in our cities. But we will go to Madrid, for example, if we wanted to attend to university or to go to an specialized shops that cannot be found there, or to some offices or high level services, and so on. And according to this level of influence, we can distinguish different types of cities. Global cities, which are the ones that exerts its importance all around the world, they have what is called the human capital. The human capital are the people living in that city, but it's not the amount of people, but how well trained they are, what they can provide to the world. For example, the education or the formation, training they have, the ability to develop science, to have jobs, and so on. And also the economic, cultural, and political centers that can have influence all around the world because of its importance. When these cities do not exert its influence throughout all the world, but just some part of, we have national cities when its influence is just for its own country. For example, it will be the case of Madrid and Barcelona that has influence all around the, the country, and then regional cities that has influence just on some part of this country. For example, the capitals of the autonomous communities such as Valladolid or Zaragoza that has just influence over some specific regions. Finally, cities can have some problems. The most evident one is traffic. That is a consequence of the large amount of people living in a reduced space, so the density of population. Traffic jams can create noise, pollution, accidents, so on. And of course, makes the people to spend a lot of time in the traffic, losing time from their lives and making the distance longer. It's not the same trying to cross 10 kilometers with a traffic jam than without one. So it affects on how the people move. And also the agglomeration of people in general inside the cities or in the public transports. One of the most evident consequences of the traffic jam is pollution. It can be air pollution that we know very well, but it can also be acoustic or luminic pollution. The acoustic pollution is noise. The noise is generated by factories, by some activities, for example, the nightclubs and so on, and also by traffic. In order to control that, because it can cause illnesses, diseases, and mental or ear diseases, or affect to the lifestyle of the people, there are some controls. For example, creating maps of noise like this one that shows the noisiest, the loudest parts of the cities, which are, of course, the most uh, important roads of the cities. This can be prevent, for example, controlling the traffic, placing the most loudest activities outside the cities, or creating like this, these barriers that prevent the noise from the highway to go to the residential places. The most evident consequence of contamination of pollution is this air pollution that creates this gap of smog, this mixture of fog and smoke that cover the cities and can create a microclimate over the different cities because it prevents the heat to go out. It creates some sort of second greenhouse effect. So it's like a barrier that makes the heat to stay in. For that reason, cities have its own climate. It's a couple of degrees uh, warmer than the regular climate of that area, and that affects on people, but also affects on plants, animals, and even the building themselves that can corrode because of the pollution. It's a very important problem, especially in the less developed countries, because as you know, the cities are located closer, the industries are located closer to the cities in these countries. It's a thing that do not happen in Europe, but it's very important in other areas. And also the security controls are lesser, there are less environmental regulation and so on. This is Ulaanbaatar considered to be the most polluted capital in the world. Or here we can see a dancer in a Buddhist monastery in Nepal, having a mask to protect from the pollution. And another important problem that the cities cause are the solid urban waste, the SUW, that accumulates is just the rubbish, the trash that the people dump, that accumulate in the dumpsters and can also pollute the city, the land, or the air because of the wind or the rain that makes this rubbish to filter on the land. It needs to be managed, it needs to be stored, and when possible, recycle or if not, incinerated, so burn it. This, of course, created pollution, but it's difficult to manage this amount of rubbish. It also costs money because the garbage disposal trucks and the people that work here needs to be paid, need to be maintained, and so on. This is, for example, a bike graveyard in China with thousands and thousands of bikes, like here, which is a very important problem of such a densely populated area as China. And another less obvious problem of the cities are the inequalities. Cities have different areas, as we have explained several times already, and these areas has different economic levels. For example, the city center will be more expensive, and for that reason, the people that can live there are richer, while other areas have less quality and poorer people live there. And if there are controls to avoid these inequalities, it only makes these differences between rich and poor stronger and wider. For example, here in Buenos Aires, Argentina, we can see the modern city center with the tall buildings at the background, and here these slums or shanty towns built with provisional materials, without any services, without pavements on the roads, without uh, electricity or water. So the people is living in very, very bad conditions. Here we can see it. It's very evident the difference between the two parts of the city. So the cities have some problems, traffic and pollution. This cause a high cost because of the payment of the gas and the cars themselves, the measures to prevent pollution, and so on. It causes a land use. The land needs to be occupied by the city because it's growing more and more. Long commutes. The commute is the trip you do to go to your work, to your job. So when you go to work, you commute. So a long time going to work. And of course, it can cause accidents and the pollution, air pollution, water pollution, soil pollution, and so on, creating, for example, microclimates, damaging the animals, plants, the human beings, and even the buildings. The urban solid waste that accumulates in the cities needs to be selected, recycled, storage, and incinerated, so burned. It causes a high cost, needs to be paid, and can also cause pollution because of the air that takes the rubbish out, or the rain, or the smoke from this incinerator. It also created social inequalities because of the differences in cities that we have mentioned. The house prices makes some people to live in some areas and some other to live in others, and for that reason is a need uh, for the government to regulate these places in order to avoid the inequalities, because it can lead to social exclusion, which is leaving some groups, some parts of the population outside the common society based on the economic level, the ethnicity, nationality, or so on. And there's risk of the appearance of shanty towns. Shanty towns are very, very poor quality houses where people live together. They are crowded, they do not follow a plan, they do not have services, and the quality of life is very poor. And more important, if the people living there cannot develop a normal life, they cannot attend to a proper school, they do not have healthcare, and so on, they will not break the cycle. So they will continue living in very poor conditions, so their children will live in poor conditions as well, and their children as well. So we need to regulate these differences in order to create opportunities for all. The last part of our unit is this definition, which is segregation. Segregation is the division, separation, the exclusion of some part of the population, setting apart some people or group based on ethnic, so ethnicity, race, for example, or nationality, political, economical, or religious criteria. So discrimination of people for some reason. With this, we have finished our unit. And as a practice, we need to do some activities. We need to do the exam preparation of the second part of Unit 9 that you can find on our Google Drive folder. We also need to do a test that can also be found in Google Drive. And we will have to do a summary or diagram of our unit, exactly the same that we have been doing all the year. It is for the 20th of May. You still have time, but please do not leave it for the last moment. Try to do it as soon as possible. So if there are some problems or anything that I can help you, I will. Do not hesitate to write me if there are any doubt or any question. Thank you very much for watching, and do not forget to do the activities and the tests we have sent in the Google Drive.